I will now invite up on the stage with me Wolfgang Blau, our next speaker. Wolfgang is an international media manager and journalist. He is currently visiting research fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University, where he studies the potential and challenges for journalism in covering climate change. Previously, he was the Global COO and President International at Condé Nast, overseeing all Condé Nast companies and licensing partners across the world. Prior to Condé Nast, Wolfgang served as Executive Director of Digital Strategy at The Guardian and Editor-in-Chief of The Zeit Online, where he won Germany's Chief Editor of the Year award. He's an advisor to the United Nations Climate Change Division, UNFCCC, for their Resilience Frontiers initiative, and a Trustee Director of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Next to all of this, he also manages to run a highly informing and entertaining Twitter feed. He described being on this stage today in front of real people without mute buttons, both strange and wonderful. We hope more wonderful than strange. Wolfgang will be sharing the results of his 50-plus interviews with newsrooms across the globe on covering climate change, the internal obstacles, and how to overcome them. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Hello, everyone. It's true. It must have been 1.5 years or so since I've last been with a group of real people. No mute buttons, no frames around your faces, no hide self-view. So this is wonderful. And of course, a great honor to be involved in the same event as Bill McKibben. What a pioneer, what a journalist, what a fighter. I'm here, I think, for two reasons, two questions that have been confronting me at least since the last 10 years now. One is, as I became more able to recruit journalists myself, for various roles that had to do with aspects of environmentalism or the climate crisis more directly, I kept wondering why it was so difficult to find the right people for these roles. And I don't mean meteorologists with a journalism degree, but sometimes I would have needed a fashion journalist who can competently write about the fashion industry, but also has a solid climate literacy, understands the difference between politics and policy and how policy making works, has a systemic view on the world, has a basic understanding of organizational change and organizational psychology, and can bring that systemic approach to any vertical, from fashion, travel, architecture, urban planning, or whatever it is. So I spoke with journalism schools and I said, I'm hiring quite a lot of people, and I sometimes have to invite them to change countries just to fill the role. Can it be that the training is not right anymore, the curriculum? But in light of all the things that Bill McKibben just mentioned, this enormous time pressure we are under, and the few years we have left really to make these unprecedented changes, I realized that if I would be quick, it would take us 5 years for the first graduate to hit the job market, and most likely, because it would be a British or an American journalism school, they would end up again working for the BBC or the New York Times to make their tuition back. So what did we actually win? Now I'm most interested in the question of what it takes to equip every single working journalist, freelance or employed, to add the climate dimension, where there is one, to any topic they're working on anyway. In health journalism, in food journalism, in gardening journalism, you name it. Because of course, as you all know, there is no sector, no segment of our economies, of our societies, exempt from the need to completely rethink how we do and consume and make things, and how we keep ourselves warm and transport ourselves. So that was one question. The other one was about that oddity that survey after survey of audiences, readerships, viewerships, they tend to express that they would like to read, see, hear a lot more about health and about the environment, or more recently, specifically about the climate crisis. And yet there's quite a lot, when you see the audience data, quite a lot of so-called climate journalism that is not really being read. And on the outside, you think it receives a disproportionately high amount of shares and likes and comments on social media, so you would think it also has a high number of clicks and good scroll depth, good session time, but that's often not the case. So I got interested in what kind of journalism, what kind of formats or forms of presentation are needed to reach people? Those two questions then led me to start a fellowship to really explore this more. And just so you're clear, I'm not a consultant. I have next to no interest in consulting. I do a lot of workshops with newsrooms right now, but I do this for my own preparation as much as anyone else. The context, before we get into what's happening in news organizations, the context is an obvious one. Not much to add to what Bill McKibben said. We're currently overshooting. If you look at the latest submissions for the Glasgow Summit, the so-called NDCs, we're looking at a degree of global warming that is much, much higher than 1.5 or even 2 degrees. Of those countries, the important ones, large emitters, such as the US or Germany or China, are either insufficient or highly insufficient currently to reach a 1.5 degree goal. So we have an external emergency journalistically that indicates there's a topic. This is audience interest, a Reuters Institute survey across 40 countries where, with the exception of 2 Nordic countries, every other country with a large, sometimes vast majority says they're highly concerned about climate change. So there's an audience interest there. There's this most recent study published by Nature, especially amongst young people, where 59% of a survey amongst 10,000 young people say they're either extremely worried or very worried about climate change. And especially as media organizations want to reach young people, this, strategically speaking, also indicates an enormous opportunity to be relevant to these readers, again, that often have left so-called mainstream news organizations. Then context number 3, there are political leaders that speak about the climate crisis. And I found this tweet by President Biden so interesting because he said, tackling climate change will take every lever and every agency of the federal government, no longer just the EPA, for instance. That's why I have launched a whole-of-government approach to deal with the crisis. And I think there's an equivalent to that in news organizations. Yes, climate desks are great, science desks are great. What we need is an all-vertical approach to this story because no vertical is exempt from the impact of climate change and from being required to engage with mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And then the commercial opportunity. For years, I have been told there's no money to be made in climate journalism. Advertisers want to be in happy environments, and that is true. You want your luxury product, your car, next to something that is constructive and happy. Which is why lifestyle ad rates, lifestyle publishing ad rates are so much higher usually than those of general news publishers. This is a very recent story in Adweek where I have been interviewed myself, and the numbers are striking. They say just of BBC, Bloomberg Green, the Financial Times, they say the Financial Times says the value of campaigns related to sustainability has tripled over the last 12 months. And globally, between 50% and 2/3 of ad briefs received by BBC Global News are focused on sustainability. Now, of course, there's a huge amount of greenwashing going on, but not all of that is greenwashing. And it certainly can't be said anymore that climate journalism can pay for itself. You may also have heard, for instance, from The Guardian, that their climate journalism helps drive donations and subscriptions. I've also noticed that the New York Times, when I look at their advertising material for their paywall subscription, many times they show a screenshot of the homepage of their climate vertical. And that is, these things are not coincidental. So with those external opportunities I've just described, politically, what's happening around us naturally, audience needs, and the commercial opportunities, why is it that climate journalism, most of what we see, or in a broader sense, the coverage of the climate crisis and emerging solutions, feels so inadequate? And I do want to be fair, a lot has happened in the last 5 years. I remember back when, at The Guardian, when I was involved in this Keep It in the Ground campaign that Bill mentioned earlier, there was a perceived shortage of content, which is why I've then set up a content syndication, content sharing alliance globally. That has changed. There is a fairly large amount of content, but it feels siloed. And what we're seeing increasingly are news organizations with climate desks. They even signal the climate desk's importance by putting it into the top-level navigation of their website, for instance. But magically or intentionally, for business reasons, this content never quite makes it into the primetime slots or into those top 1, 2 slots on a website where often you can drive substantial traffic, or into their main social media accounts. With that question, I started just talking to news organizations, asking very open questions, starting with, how are you doing? And sometimes I didn't get to ask my next question for 5 minutes. And then sometimes, what are your plans to expand your coverage? What are the obstacles? What are the opportunities? How are you organized in your newsroom? And then followed up asking the few academics that exist. There is a lot of climate communication and science communication research. There's surprisingly little research being done comparatively on climate journalism. The institute I found the most useful also for what we're doing here in the UK is Monash University in Australia. Really remarkable work they're doing. More about that in a few minutes. And then I ran a quantitative survey testing some of those patterns that have emerged just to make sure I heard the right thing. So I have a bias here, a known bias. My bias is that, yes, it is fantastic that we have new niche publications that cover nothing but the energy industry or climate change. But I think it is hugely important that the big brand news organizations, many of them represented here in this room today, wonderfully so, up their game. And that is because we don't even have time to grow new alternative publications to the sufficient scale in the time that we have left. And also, trust is hugely important in covering topics that can induce so much fear and concern. And you can't replicate or regrow the trust of major news organizations that had decades and sometimes more than 100 years to establish themselves in their societies. So my interest is in how to help managers, editors of mid-sized to large news organizations who now sometimes say, we don't quite understand. We have launched this climate desk or expanded our coverage already 2 or 3 years ago, but it's not quite doing what we hoped it would be doing. And from what I have found, and I'm sure it's not a complete list, there are about 12 items you should check whether you've got them right. They are mostly operational and fairly easy to address because of that. Cultural, some of them more difficult to change as always, and some of them are ethical, where a normative shift is needed in management, and some organizations have made these shifts already. Climate literacy in the newsroom, hugely important, and it strikes me as odd that in the entry exams for news organizations, if you apply for a trainee program, you're expected to know a country's national election system. Even if you've never touched a football, it's expected that you know the basic rules of football. Or cricket, depending on the country. But it's somehow okay to not know the difference in the effect of Arctic ice and Antarctic ice melting, which in the news constantly gets treated almost synonymously. Or to not know the basic mechanics of the natural greenhouse effect. So that is an issue, and different from COVID, where news organizations really have shown that they can learn very quickly. With COVID, it wasn't embarrassing to not know because it was new. But if you speak with editors about climate change, there's often this undertone that they say, I probably should know that already. So there's an element of embarrassment. And newsroom management needs to help people over that threshold. Climate literacy of the audiences. I just spoke this morning to, I would consider a man fairly educated. I had recent chats with him about architecture, and I said, have you heard of the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 degree goal? And he had never heard of it. And that's no exception. In so much of climate journalism, we refer to the IPCC report, to the 1.5 degree goal, which in the US is almost funny in a country that wouldn't even know what Celsius is mostly and how to translate that into Fahrenheit. So we cannot assume knowledge, and certainly we have to measure it. And news organizations are measuring that degree of knowledge amongst their audiences, for instance, through quizzes. Online trolling, not the same on COVID, much better funded on climate. I spoke to editors who said, I want to withdraw from that beat. I can't take the beating, and my newsroom thinks something must be wrong with my journalism. Access to scientists, the right visuals for stories, especially in TV. What newsroom structure? Do I have a climate desk? Do I have an expanded science desk? Do I pursue a hub approach? All of those require a high degree of engagement from newsroom management for them to work. Impact metrics was one that surprised me. I spoke to a couple of climate desk leaders who said, everything's great. My editor-in-chief is bragging with my work. I got the budget I always wanted. And I said, so what's the problem now? They say, the news desk. The news desk doesn't put my stories in the top slot or publishes them not during prime time, but in the odd times because they say it doesn't click well, which has to do with metrics and how we measure the success and the lack of impact metrics. Attribution of extreme weather events, a lot of progress has been made. I think also in Europe this summer you have seen a reference to climate change much more often with these extreme events. But sometimes news organizations also mistake with preemptively attributing climate change to a weather event where there's no evidence yet, and then they make them unnecessarily vulnerable. And then the last piece is audience segmentation, knowing who we are talking to. And a lot of journalism currently focuses on trying to convert the climate science deniers, not realizing that in most countries, they are now a small minority. And we need to focus on the center of people who fully acknowledge climate science, but then don't make that next step of realizing what it means to only have, as of today, 3,007 days left until that year 2030, by which supposedly we will have to cut our emissions by half. This is work by Monash University, where they have done segmentation studies. There's the 6 Americas from alarmed, concerned, dismissive. These exist in different countries. And it's important to have that for your country so that you can then, this is in Australia, match your own news organization with that segmentation so you know who do you even have amongst your audience. How big is your share of deniers versus people who are very, very worried and need maybe a slightly different framing also on certain stories. The cultural challenges are the silification, and that can also play out that you have this wonderful new climate desk, and now they're being asked to help the travel desk with a travel story, and they say, no, we absolutely do not want the travel desk to write stories with the climate angle because they'll get it wrong. Very similar theme to digitization of newsrooms, when the digital team didn't want the other team to get engaged because they will make mistakes initially. Mental health of staff. We know a lot about the mental health of war reporters. There's a different stress on people who work on climate change, as many of you will know from your own experience. And this cognitive dissonance of looking into the abyss day in, day out, and having that sense that people around you in your newsroom are not seeing it or are not acknowledging it, that can cause a very hideous kind of mental stress, and they need support from newsroom management. That's a lot, I know. I can share these slides with you. And I know you will recognize most of these from various conversations or conflicts you may have in your newsroom. Journalism is often being described as the first draft of history. Camus said journalists are historians of the moment, and what that says, journalism is looking back mostly, especially newsroom journalism. And yet, with covering the climate crisis, while we see the effects of it today, so many of the discussions and controversies, whether it's about the models and how it will continue or about the effects of various mitigation measures, are about events in 10, 20, 30 years from now. And it's important to acknowledge that journalism isn't quite set up for that, for that high degree of speculation. And to know that helps to have more empathy. As a routine in my conversations, I always ask people what they thought about the notion of solutions journalism and constructive journalism, given that there's so much research that indicates that people engage more and are more willing to come back to verticals that also point towards things that are being done, could be done. I ran into almost nothing but pushback on that idea, especially by so-called climate journalists or science journalists, because there's this misunderstanding in the room that solutions-centric journalism means sugarcoating reality, which it isn't. That needs to be clarified. Ethically, the activism argument, the only thing I want to say, the press owes its freedom of the press to activists who have fought for it. That's the starting point. Activism is hugely important to move our societies forward. Having said that, I also want to emphasize that journalism and activism are not the same things. And personally, I think it's a deflection discussion whether journalists should be activists. If news organizations would do their job in covering the climate crisis and the scientific evidence adequately, activism wouldn't be needed. But that is something that needs to be clarified. And I do see activism in newsrooms where I think it shouldn't happen, especially when it comes to declaring one adaptation or mitigation strategy as the only one, when the optionality is missing of what else is there. And I don't think that's good journalism. The false balance trap, I think a lot has been said about that already. Most important one, news value criteria. When you ask a news desk editor by which criteria does she or he decide that this piece is news and this isn't, you never get the list or the flow chart, but inevitably it's about the recency, news, did it happen just now? The geographic vicinity, if it happened here, it's more important than if it happened on another continent. A certain simplicity, I shouldn't need 3 footnotes to explain the topic. And ideally, it can be told through the frame of a person or an event. So it's event over processes. And you will see by now that just those 4 typical criteria are an almost certain filter for the climate crisis to not make it on the top of the news list. It's never quite now. It's always worse in the future. It's never quite here as long as you're not in the middle of a disaster zone. It's worse somewhere else. Pole caps and those stories, Amazon. It's certainly not simple or monocausal compared to a crime story. And it is a process. And then you have this, to use an invented word, this fake eventification where the breaking off of a major ice sheet is more newsworthy than a study that indicates that we may have reached or are nearing a tipping point in the Antarctic, which is much bigger news, but not an event such as the ice sheet. It's difficult to change those. Having worked with newsrooms are built on the idea of not changing, and it has served them well to resist outside influence of any sort, even from their own management. But there is another metric or another criterion, that's the public interest. And that is where newsroom managers can make a normative shift, as it just happened at Agence France Presse with their, 1,800 journalists. Their chief editor's team said to their entire staff worldwide, and they're in the process of implementing that, they said, if there is a climate angle or a future of the planet angle, as they call it, including biodiversity, to your story, we consider it as important as any financial angle there may be to that story. So in closing, climate change is not just a topic. And it shouldn't be a surprise that in this time when everything has to change, everything we do, how we eat, how we dress, how we build our houses, how we transport, it would be odd if journalism wouldn't have to change as well. And yet our reflexes still are, as an industry, to treat it as a topic, and we have processed many other topics, including World War II. We'll get this one done as well, and it's only a question of budget. No, it isn't. It requires real change. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. That is a very long list of challenges to overcome. I'll start with taking questions from the room, and yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Wolfgang. Lovely. Thank you very much. Until recently, I was working at the BBC, working with the editorial guys in the newsroom, developing editorial strategies, training people. I recognize every single one of those points that you've made, so I'm totally on board with you on this. Question for you. One of the key issues we faced is holding politicians to account in an era where there seem to be, facts don't matter anymore. They're taken spin to a different level. How do you think journalism can address that, really holding politicians to account on this topic and on, linking the words with the actions of the policies and holding them to account, really?
It's an indirect approach I would take. I find it really difficult for journalism to do its job, to have an effect, if there's so little basic understanding in our newsrooms, as I've mentioned, but also amongst our audiences. We have been looking at, do people deny climate science or do they acknowledge it? And now we're beginning to realize that acknowledging climate science and expressing a trust in scientific principles is not the same as also knowing the basics of where the main emissions come from or what the options are. So people are easy victims to someone saying, oh, we'll fix it with solar geoengineering. And I think fact-checking journalism is hugely important, but it needs to meet an audience that has the basics to have a context. And there's work being done in various groups right now. What worked so well with covering COVID is that as a journalism ecosystem, together with governments and health institutes, we agreed, I don't know how that agreement happened, it seemed so practical, on a small set of metrics, vaccination rates, hospitalization rates, things like that. There could have been 30 metrics, so every news organization could have picked their own set of metrics. And yet, we all know these metrics by now, and we are missing that in covering climate change. And these metrics, if you know nothing about transmission paths, these metrics help you understand where the story is currently at over time. Also, these are not just challenges I mentioned, these are more check marks. These can be addressed. They really can be addressed. They are not insurmountable. I'm quite optimistic, actually, for news organizations to make big leaps in these next 12 months.
Any other questions for Wolfgang? I can ask one. So you mentioned obviously the point around journalists are the historians of the present, and it's retrospective and it's difficult for it to think about the future. What do you see as the role of other parts of media outside of journalism? Think of science fiction, think of scripted TV series. Do you think there's a role to play for them to bring the future perspective more into play? Or do you think journalism can do that? It's just not at the moment doing it very well?
I think given the time pressure we are under, given that journalism only reaches segments of a population, journalism can't possibly now, from not being up to the task, now making the mistake at the other end of the spectrum and thinking it's all on us. What we can do, though, is news organizations, especially these big brand news organizations, journalism, let me start over. Journalism is not only the content you produce. Journalism is the conversations you inform and inspire and trigger and facilitate. And many news organizations and broadcasters are fantastic conveners and conference organizers and can, for instance, create a forum of different sports leagues and say, you all have social media footprints that often dwarf ours. And if you, only once a month in an account the size of Manchester United, mention the difference, maybe in a playful manner, maybe as a quiz between Arctic eyes and Antarctic eyes, or the role of agriculture, the effect will be huge. So culture, every sector, other institutions, cultural institutions need to pull their weight.
One final question. You've obviously spoken to a lot of newsrooms, and you've just given us a very long checklist of things to do to improve the way we cover climate change. What is the best example you've seen? What organization really gets this and really has implemented this already and is working?
I see a lot of, I'm not trying to dodge your question to not step on anyone's feet, but I see a lot of news organizations trying different models. There's a newspaper in Germany, a left liberal newspaper that is small, doesn't have a lot of money, and instead of a climate desk, they said, let's create a hub. So 2 or 3 times a week, editors who are interested, not necessarily the leaders of the economics desk or the culture desk, but the most passionate people in that team, meet to discuss everything they're planning this week and to see if they can detect climate angles in their stories and if they can collaborate. I find that an interesting model because there's a majority of small news organizations. And then the other example I just mentioned from Agence France Presse, where they said there is an ethical shift necessary and it can happen within the constraints of journalistic integrity. I find hugely inspiring and encouraging because of the impact of the newswire.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang.